Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses the potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're discussing elevator rescue and some best practices for your organization to consider. I want to welcome Sam Clark to the program. Sam is the owner of Clark Fire and Safety Training, and his organization specializes in elevator rescue. Sam, I want to thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Chris. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. That's wonderful to hear. We mentioned in the opening that you're engaged in elevator rescue training. How long have you been instructing elevator courses?
Well, I began presenting sessions on elevator rescue on a non-formal basis about 1995, and then after being put on as a fire instructor, I started doing them on a structured basis for two different community colleges for well over 20 years now.
So who should be conducting elevator rescues? Is it someone that has knowledge of elevators, before attempting a rescue? Who should be doing these?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I guess honestly it would depend who you talk to. Obviously, qualified elevator personnel in a perfect world would be ideal for them to conduct all of the elevator rescues, but in the real world, that's just not a reality. At times, they're not available. They're not on site. So the answer to that is kind of multifaceted. And if there's elevator personnel available, they would be the first choice. Some facilities that are large and have many elevators, they experience elevator rescues quite often. An example might be a college or university or a hospital setting. A lot of times in the healthcare setting, they'll have facilities personnel that do simple elevator rescues during the daytime hours, but yet after hours it becomes safety and security, and then after that, through the night, it becomes a local fire department. One thing I would say is it is a reasonable expectation that the fire and emergency services also respond to these incidents, and they do daily across the country. So a lot of it's dependent on the situation and where it occurs.
So I have an irrational fear of getting caught in an elevator in a parking garage because I live in Texas and it can be very hot. So let's say that my fear comes to fruition. What's some of the equipment that's going to be staged or going to be used before they come and execute that rescue?
Well, the fire department is going to respond. We've said for years what's going to happen is dependent on the level of training. So that's a very true statement. If the fire and emergency services have some base training, I would say their largest tool is knowing what to do, or education. The education piece is paramount. Elevator rescue is one of those things where without proper training, you kind of don't know what the next step is, and the outcome is not obviously the best all of the time. So specific to your question, they're going to use various keys, elevator keys to open doors, keys to get in the mechanical room, lockout tag out for power control, lights, radios, perhaps some hooks to reach and manipulate things on the elevator. And also, not day to day, but on occasion, they're going to need fall protection equipment and maybe a few ladders.
So how long is the training typically on elevator emergencies?
Well, the fire service in general has approached things from an awareness standpoint, followed by an operations level of training, which would be indicative of hands-on and actually doing the skill sets. And then some rescue disciplines go to a technician level, and the base training for awareness would be typically 8 hours for a fire and rescue organization. And that would cover, everything to do with the elevator, and awareness to what the hazards and what the risks are and what you should need to know. The operations level training basically is a 2-day program or a 16-hour course that would cover all the manipulative skills that are needed.
So is there a standard related to elevator rescue? And if so, do you teach to that standard in your courses?
Chris, there is. There's not much available when it comes to the education piece for the fire and emergency services, you can find some YouTubes out there that fire departments make. There's obviously senior fire personnel, what they pass on. There's a few textbooks out there that are pretty good, but not a lot available coming from the elevator industry. Speaking to your exact question, what is the standard that I teach to? The courses that I deliver are laid out to meet the intent of the ASME A17.4 standard. ASME is American Society of Mechanical Engineers. A17 in its entire form is the Elevator Safety Code, which is here in Pennsylvania is adopted by reference in the code. And 17.4 is one chapter of that entire code that is written as a specific guide for emergency personnel. So that is what I teach to the intent of that standard.
So definitely a specific standard, but it also sounds like the University of YouTube can help out a little bit.
There's a little bit there, but social media does wonders in this format, an example, but it also, you have to verify where the source is coming from.
Yeah, it's not always, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. You mentioned fall protection as some of the equipment that's going to be brought to the scene. Can you elaborate on some of the risks that are associated with conducting an elevator rescue?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to do that. I'm pretty passionate about this topic. It's one of the reasons I've been teaching it for well over 20 years. Some of the risks associated first would be risk of injury to the person that is trapped in the elevator. Our first concern should be the person that's in the predicament, stuck in the elevator. The second priority should be that of the welfare of the rescuers. So we need to take care of ourselves. We need to not injure ourselves when we're conducting these rescues. One thing that presents on a fairly regular basis is I will get a phone call from a fire chief somewhere and says, "Hey, I need to talk to you. We have a problem." And with a short conversation, we determined that the fire department had responded to a simple stuck elevator call. Someone just couldn't get out. And fire department, because of educational deficits, they end up doing incredible amounts of damage to the elevator system itself. And that's really not the ideal outcome for anyone. And lastly, it's not a popular statement, but fire and rescue organizations are actually at risk of legal action from improper actions or injury or death. Tort liability is a real thing today. So it's really important that we address those risks.
So are modern day elevators more difficult to negotiate when you're effecting a rescue versus the older models? I bring this up because I was in San Antonio at a hospital or a hotel, and I walked into the elevator to push the floor that I was supposed to go on, and there was just a computer screen. I had to go back out and scan my card, and it told me what elevator to go to, and it took me to the exact floor. So they're rapidly changing from what we historically know from just pushing a button to go to the floor. So has that changed to how you approach rescue?
Yes, to answer your question, Chris, modern day elevators are more difficult than the old legacy models. Before I elaborate on that, I'd just like to say this, that all elevators, regardless of the vintage, can be a pretty significant challenge to the rescuers if they have no basic training. So it's one of those incidents where unless you have some formal training, you don't even really know where to get started. Speaking more specific to your question about the modern day elevators, you're spot on. They are much more of a challenge. What we have is a high-tech machine that's also coupled with high technology. So there's a lot of change has occurred. There are numerous specific challenges to the newer elevators. One of them is car door restrictors. Most people are not aware that there's an outer door called the hoistway door on every floor, every level the elevator serves, and that needs to be opened during a rescue. And then we need to couple that with good risk management based on where the car is. So then the car door itself, and this is a new challenge, it has a high-tech lock assembly called a car door restrictor on the inner car. And that's something the fire and emergency services never had to defeat before. So that comes into play. Another item would be learning power control locations, which that used to be a standard item always in a physical room, an elevator machine room, and that's not always present today.
So you just elaborated on a lot of the technical issues that come with, modernization of elevators. Are there some additional, tough challenges that rescuers need to be aware of when conducting a rescue?
Well, the issue at hand is, in the absence of training, there's a good probability the fire department's going to do some type of significant damage. It's not a rescue discipline that you go and you try something and you simply figure it out. The doors are complex, the control systems are complex, and the drive systems are complex. So there's a lot of moving parts here. The biggest challenge is risk management. Without that formal education on, is it safe to take the person out or is it not safe to take them out, you can see that outcome can be not favorable.
I think this is something that you hit on before, but I'll circle back to it. Are there some common educational deficits that emergency responders typically have with regard to elevators, whether it be technology, mechanical, or something different?
Well, again, I did cover some of that, but you're correct coming back to it. Training and knowledge of risks and how to manage the risk, I think that's one of the largest deficits. Also, just recognizing that you could open an elevator door and the elevator car is not there and you're standing right in front of an open shaft, and that presents a serious fall hazard. So just knowledge that there is a fall hazard and managing that fall risk. And then lastly, new technology presents where it becomes somewhat of a challenge on certain elevators of how to control power. And the goal with locking out and tagging out and isolating energy is that we prevent the movement of the car doors and or the elevator up and down, which is a challenge and a risk to us.
This next question, it might not always be feasible, but should we be requesting a technician from an elevator company, maybe during our training program, or if possible, if we're going to do a rescue? Is that something that we should consider?
It is at times. I guess the base statement I would make, if the situation that you're presented with exceeds your level of training, then you should always reach out to that subject matter expert, which comes from the elevator industry. I would ask that if you're not sure of what to do, that you reach out for that subject matter expert and have the building owner or manager call the elevator company.
So what information should an ESO tell a property owner after a rescue has been conducted?
Well, the reason we showed up probably is because the thing's malfunctioning. So obviously we want to make the rescue. We want to take care of the person that's trapped. Two things we ought to do all the time is we need to visually ensure. We need to look inside a car that somebody is reported stuck in, and we need to make sure there is no one in there. There have been incidents where someone's stuck in an elevator. The fire department was summoned. They showed up and called out verbally, got no response, and cleared the scene, only to find that a person who was hearing impaired was in the car. And we need to ensure, if we're called to a scene, that we're at the correct address and that no one's in the elevator. Your specific question, what should the ESO tell the building owner? Advise them that we shut the main power off and that they are advised to not turn it back on and not put it in service until it's been looked at by qualified repair personnel.
Yeah, don't just put the next group of people on there and fire
Correct.
it back up once it's been cleared after the rescue. Get that thing looked at by the pros.
Yes, sir.
So can you elaborate on what is an MRL, and is that a concern for the fire service?
Yes, I can do that. An MRL is an acronym that was created by the elevator industry itself, and an MRL stands for Machine Roomless Elevator. It basically means that the drive system, that part that makes it go up and down in the shaft, and also the control system, it's not in a dedicated brick and mortar elevator machine room anymore. It is all contained within the elevator hoistway or at sometimes in the door jamb of the elevator itself. So it's not, the power control and drive systems are not where they're typically found.
So they almost need to be educated a little bit on the different types of systems that are in their service area.
That's correct. And not always, but pretty frequently, the power control points for MRLs are inside locked doors that the fire and rescue services don't even know they're there and don't have the keys for.
So in your opinion, ideally, how many rescuers should be present to conduct a successful rescue?
The fire service is pretty wide and diverse, so it depends on locality and where you're at, what your resource base is. A general statement was 2 staffed companies to respond, and we typically split that up, that one company goes to the stalled car and the other company is used to access and locate power control. So if you put that in numbers, I guess the NFPA would look at a staffed company as 4 firefighters. So we're looking at about 8 would be a good starting point. I will mention that many day-to-day simple stalled cars only require minimal manipulation, perhaps of a reset, a power control. So that might be a simple one company event, but we don't know conditions until we arrive. The other side of that is in a blind shaft where an elevator doesn't serve every floor, you could have a car stuck 10 floors from a landing. And if the elevator industry can't mitigate that, then we might get into a tech rescue incident and would require significant more events. But that is not a day-to-day occurrence.
So Brian DeQuinn is an associate of mine, and he's joining us, and he had a quick question that he wanted to ask. Brian?
So Sam, kind of talking about that, I think it's also important that we look at, should we have an SOG or an SOP in place for these type of operations? They're likely a low frequency, high risk style event. Is that something that you would recommend that emergency or services organizations do some research and develop a strong policy or procedure that kind of guides that?
That's correct, Brian. I'm not a fan of a fire and emergency service organization that has three binders on their shelf with 450 SOGs, and that's not real life that all your personnel are going to have that. But for day-to-day emergencies that we respond to, whether it's a gas leak, a structural fire, or an elevator rescue, we should have some standard approach to it. There should be an expected outcome or behavior by the fire personnel so that they have a known guideline, something that is to a recommended standard. In my classes, I do hand out a sheet called recommended practices for simple elevator entrapments, and I believe that I've shared that with you. You're welcome to make that available. But yes, I am in favor of a standard operating guideline.
And it's important that, you have shared that with us, and we greatly appreciate it. And that will be displayed on our Responder Help website for our listeners to be able to go in and look at. Obviously, that's not the policy, but it's certainly something that they can integrate into a policy or procedure.
So if you had to give one piece of advice to an organization about elevator rescue, what would that be?
Well, Chris, we're sitting here. I guess I have the latitude to give you 2 answers. My first inclination would be to say that elevators are everywhere, and they are a challenge if you don't have base training. So one side of myself wants to say, take basic training. The other side of me says, if I only get one shot to tell you one thing, turn the drive power off to the elevator, because the most common mistake the fire and emergency services makes without formal training, they go to an incident, it's a machine rescue, it's nothing short of it, and they start manipulating doors, trying to gain access, trying to get people out, and the common error is to not shut the power off. We wouldn't work on a PTO limb entrapment on a farm accident without shutting the power off. We wouldn't work on an industrial machine to effect a rescue without shutting the power off. So that's very important. Shut the power off.
So is there any truth to if an elevator falls and I jump at the right time that I can survive?
No, I believe Mythbusters dispelled that. That's not a good plan. And
so that's not on your suggestion sheet?
No,
okay,
that's not on my suggestions.
So do you teach this program in other states, or is this just a PA program at this time?
I have, Chris. I've delivered the program as far north as Maine and as far south as Southern Virginia. My base of operations, most of my work is in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but depending on the request and the conditions, I will travel. So I have presented in 5 different states.
So how can people reach out to you if they're interested in this important training?
Well, At this time, I do not have a website. It's planned for 2023, and the best way to reach me is through my cell phone at 717-598-5014 or my email at ftig75@gmail.com.
And we'll make sure to include all that information in the description and that resource that you provided so our clients can have a copy of that. Well, Sam, I really want to thank you for walking us through all those suggestions. It was a lot of great information, and I want to thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Chris. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program today and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guest, Sam Clark, once again for his time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFIS Risk Control at VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.